Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1857, when the Thornton plantation stood among the sprawling cotton fields of Wilkes County, Georgia. The plantation house, with its imposing white columns, was considered the jewel of the region, sitting atop a gentle hill overlooking nearly 2,000 acres of land. Edmund Thornton, a man of considerable wealth and influence, maintained strict order over his domain and the 63 enslaved individuals who worked his fields. His young wife, Catherine, barely 23 years old, presided over the household with an air of fragile propriety. What few outside the plantation knew was that behind the perfectly maintained facade, a series of events had been set in motion that would shatter the Thornton legacy forever. The morning of March 12, 1857, began like any other spring day in Wilkes County, with mist rising from the cotton fields and the sound of work bells ringing across the plantation grounds. Jacob Pritchard, the head overseer who had served the Thornton family for nearly 15 years, made his customary rounds of the property, checking that all operations proceeded according to schedule. His daily report, later entered into evidence during court proceedings, noted nothing unusual until approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, when he approached the old cotton storage barn at the eastern edge of the property. What he witnessed through the partially open barn door would set in motion a chain of events that county officials would spend decades attempting to suppress from public record. The discovery involved Catherine Thornton and an 18-year-old enslaved man named Samuel, and the nature of what Pritchard observed would ultimately lead to disappearances, a mysterious birth, and questions that remain unanswered over 160 years later. In the spring of 1923, a graduate student named Margaret Holloway from the University of Georgia was conducting research in the basement archives of the old Wilkes County Courthouse when she discovered a leather-bound diary tucked inside a deteriorating wooden crate marked with the year 1857. The diary belonged to Miss Abigail Thornton, a second cousin of Edmund, who had visited the plantation for an extended stay during the winter months of 1856 and into early 1857. The entry, dated January 15, 1857, provided the first documented mention of Samuel, describing him as a recently acquired house servant of approximately 18 years, who possessed an unusual refinement in his manners and bearing that set him apart from the other enslaved individuals on the property. Abigail's observations, written in the careful script typical of educated women of that era, noted that Catherine had taken a particular interest in ensuring Samuel's duties kept him primarily within the main house, often requesting his presence to serve at meals, tend the library fires, and assist with various household tasks that could easily have been performed by the female servants already working indoors. The diary entry continued with commentary that would prove prophetic, remarking that Edmund seemed entirely unaware of his wife's growing preoccupation with the young man's welfare, as the master of the house spent increasing amounts of time away from the plantation attending political meetings in Atlanta, where he hoped to secure an appointment to the state legislature. Abigail recorded that during one particular evening when Edmund had been away for nearly a week, she had observed Catherine teaching Samuel to read from a volume of poetry in the library, an act that violated both law and custom. The diary entry concluded with the cousin's expression of concern that such behavior, if discovered, could bring scandal upon the family, though she noted she had not yet decided whether to speak to Edmund upon his return or to maintain a careful silence about what she had witnessed. Plantation records unearthed during a 1954 estate sale revealed that Samuel had been purchased at auction in Savannah on September 3, 1856, for the sum of $1,200, a price considerably higher than typical for an enslaved man of his age and physical capabilities. The bill of sale, preserved among other documents in a tin box discovered in the attic of the former Thornton property, indicated that Catherine herself had accompanied Edmund to the auction, an unusual circumstance, as plantation mistresses rarely attended such events. More significantly, notations in Edmund's ledger showed that Catherine had specifically requested Samuel's purchase after observing him at the auction house, insisting that the household required additional male servants for indoor work, despite the existing staff being more than adequate for the estate's needs. The auction house records from Savannah contained a notation that Samuel had previously belonged to the Whitfield family of Charleston, where he had served as a house servant for 7 years before the family's financial collapse forced the sale of their property. Investigation into the Whitfield family history revealed that their daughter, Miss Caroline Whitfield, had secretly taught Samuel to read and write during her adolescence, a fact that emerged in her own diary, discovered by researchers in 1967 at the Charleston Historical Society. The most compelling evidence of the relationship that developed between Catherine and Samuel came from interviews conducted by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, when federal workers recorded the oral histories of formerly enslaved individuals throughout the South. In these recorded testimonies, 3 elderly individuals who had lived on the Thornton plantation as children provided remarkably consistent accounts of witnessing Catherine and Samuel together in the library on multiple occasions during the winter of 1857, describing how the mistress would read aloud from books while Samuel listened, and how on at least 2 occasions they had observed her teaching him to write letters on paper, an activity that carried severe legal penalties in Georgia at that time. A letter dated December 18, 1856, discovered among the correspondence files of Edmund's younger brother, William Thornton, who resided in Augusta, provided crucial insight into Edmund's initial awareness that something had shifted in his household, though he remained blind to the true nature of the situation developing under his own roof. The letter, written in Edmund's distinctive angular script, expressed concern about Catherine's increasingly withdrawn behavior, noting that she had taken to spending long hours alone in the library or walking the gardens unaccompanied, refusing the company of other plantation wives who called upon her, and showing little interest in the social obligations that had previously occupied her time. Edmund attributed this change to a melancholy disposition he believed common among young wives who had not yet borne children, mentioning that they had been married nearly 3 years without producing an heir, a circumstance that weighed heavily upon both their minds. More significantly, the letter contained a passage that revealed Jacob Pritchard, the overseer, had approached Edmund with concerns about what he termed irregularities in the household, specifically regarding the amount of time Catherine spent in the company of the house servants, and her particular attention to one individual whose name Edmund did not specify in the correspondence. Edmund's response to these concerns, as recorded in his own words within the letter, was dismissive to the point of mockery, stating that he had laughed at Pritchard's insinuations, and reminded the overseer that Catherine came from one of Georgia's most distinguished families, a woman of impeccable breeding and education, who would no sooner engage in improper conduct than she would abandon her Christian faith. The letter concluded with Edmund's assertion that his wife's behavior was merely the result of boredom and the isolation of plantation life, and that he intended to take her to Savannah for the social season in the spring, confident that renewed engagement with society would restore her spirits and dispel any foolish rumors that might be circulating among the servants or in the quarters. On February 11, 1857, Dr. Jeremiah Walsh was summoned to the Thornton plantation to examine Catherine, who had been experiencing symptoms that Edmund attributed to a persistent winter ailment. The physician's personal medical journal, discovered in 1967 during renovations of the basement storage area of the old Wilkes County Hospital, contained detailed entries regarding this examination and subsequent visits that painted a portrait of a patient in profound psychological distress. The entry dated February 11th confirmed that Catherine was approximately 3 months pregnant, a diagnosis that should have brought joy to a household long awaiting an heir, but instead seemed to plunge the young woman into deeper despair. Dr. Walsh noted in his meticulous hand that upon delivering this news to the couple, Catherine had responded with what he described as an alarming lack of appropriate emotion, neither smiling nor expressing pleasure, but instead turning her face to the wall and refusing to speak further on the matter. The journal entries from subsequent visits throughout February and into early March revealed an escalating pattern of concerning behavior. On February 24th, Dr. Walsh recorded that Catherine had refused to discuss the progress of her pregnancy with her husband present in the room, insisting that Edmund leave before she would answer even basic questions about her physical condition. The entry from March 3rd contained particularly cryptic notations, including the phrase, "Patient exhibits extreme agitation when questioned about conception date," and another observation that Mrs. Thornton requested assurance that certain physical characteristics of unborn children could not be determined before birth. Dr. Walsh's notes suggested his growing unease with the situation, mentioning that he had privately questioned whether Catherine suffered from the nervous disorders sometimes associated with pregnancy, though he noted her distress seemed to stem not from her condition itself, but from some unspoken fear about the child she carried. As February turned to March in 1857, Edmund's initial dismissal of his overseer's concerns began to erode in the face of Catherine's increasingly erratic behavior, which manifested in ways that even he could no longer attribute to the ordinary afflictions of pregnancy. Catherine had taken to locking the door to her private chambers, refusing Edmund entry even during evening hours when custom and marital obligation dictated his presence, offering only vague explanations about her need for solitude and rest that Dr. Walsh had supposedly prescribed, though Edmund's inquiries to the physician revealed no such recommendation had been made. More troubling still were the instructions Catherine had begun issuing regarding Samuel's duties, specifically requesting that he be assigned to tasks that kept him away from the main house entirely, asking that he work in the distant tobacco barns or assist with fence repairs on the far boundaries of the property, a complete reversal of her previous insistence that he remain among the household staff. Several servants later provided testimony, recorded in depositions taken after the events of March 12th, describing how they had observed Catherine writing letters at all hours, often by candlelight late into the night, only to burn these documents in her chamber fireplace before dawn. The most revealing testimony came from Bessie, an enslaved woman who worked as a housemaid, whose statement was preserved in the court records, kept by the magistrate who investigated the subsequent scandal. Bessie reported that on the morning of March 10th, while cleaning Catherine's chambers, she had discovered fragments of partially burned paper in the fireplace, and though most of the words had been consumed by flames, certain phrases remained legible enough to read, including the words "our child" and "cannot continue this way," along with what appeared to be the beginning of Samuel's name before the paper had charred beyond recognition. These fragments, which Bessie had mentioned to the head housekeeper, would later be sought by investigators, but by then they had been swept away with the ashes and lost to history. The events of March 12, 1857, unfolded with a swiftness that would leave no time for deliberation or mercy, transforming the Thornton plantation from a place of rigid order into a site of chaos and recrimination within a matter of hours. Jacob Pritchard's official report, submitted to Edmund and later entered into county court records during the legal proceedings that followed, stated that at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, While conducting his routine inspection of the property's outbuildings, he had approached the old cotton storage barn located at the eastern boundary of the cultivated fields, a structure that had fallen into disuse after the construction of newer facilities closer to the main processing areas. The barn door stood partially ajar, and upon investigating what he assumed might be enslaved individuals shirking their assigned duties, Pritchard observed through the opening a scene that he described in his written statement as Catherine Thornton and the house servant Samuel in an embrace of unmistakable intimacy, with the mistress's arms around the young man's shoulders and their faces close together in a manner that left no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. Pritchard's report noted that upon his entry into the barn, both parties separated immediately, with Catherine attempting to compose herself while Samuel stood motionless, and that he had ordered Samuel to remain where he stood while he escorted Catherine back to the main house. The overseer immediately informed Edmund, who had been reviewing accounts in his study, and within minutes the master of the house had ridden to the barn himself to confront Samuel. By noon, Edmund had ordered a complete lockdown of the plantation, with instructions that no one was to leave the property without his express permission, that all roads leading to and from the estate were to be watched, and that Samuel was to be confined to a storage room beneath the main house, while Edmund decided upon a course of action that would address this unthinkable violation of everything he held sacred. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, Edmund ordered Catherine confined to her chambers with a trusted house servant stationed outside the door, while Samuel remained locked in the cellar storage room beneath the main house, where enslaved individuals accused of serious infractions were typically held pending punishment. Edmund summoned the local magistrate, Horace Beaumont, to the plantation on the afternoon of March 13th to take official depositions from both parties, a decision that suggested Edmund intended to pursue formal legal proceedings. Despite the scandal such actions would bring upon his family name. The deposition taken from Samuel, preserved in the Wilkes County courthouse records and later transcribed by historians, revealed testimony extracted under circumstances that cast doubt upon its reliability, as Samuel had been denied food and water for over 24 hours, and bore visible marks consistent with physical coercion, according to notations made by Magistrate Beaumont himself in the document's margins. Samuel's recorded statement indicated that Catherine had initiated contact with him in October of 1856, approximately 1 month after his arrival at the plantation, beginning with conversations in the library, where she taught him to read from her personal collection of books. He reportedly stated that by December, Catherine had expressed her profound unhappiness in her marriage and had made explicit promises that she would secure his freedom, claiming that she intended to leave Edmund and travel north where they might live together, without the constraints imposed by Georgia law and custom. Samuel's testimony further alleged that Catherine had assured him the child she carried was his, conceived in January, and that she had been planning their escape when circumstances forced events to unfold prematurely. Catherine's own statement, however, told a markedly different story, one delivered not to the magistrate, but to her father, Colonel Benjamin Whitmore, who arrived from Augusta on March 14th, after receiving an urgent summons from Edmund. According to a letter Colonel Whitmore later wrote to his attorney, Catherine claimed that Samuel had taken advantage of moments when she was alone, that his persistent attention had frightened her, and that she had been coerced into silence through threats. Despite Edmund's desperate attempts to contain knowledge of the scandal within the plantation boundaries, news of the events at the Thornton estate spread through Wilkes County with remarkable speed, carried by servants who had family connections on neighboring properties, by tradesmen who supplied the plantation, and by the physician Dr. Walsh, whose professional discretion apparently faltered in the face of such extraordinary circumstances. The Wilkes County Gazette, in its edition, dated March 19, 1857, contained a carefully worded notice that avoided explicit details while conveying sufficient information to ensure that informed readers would understand its meaning, stating that a scandal of the most serious nature has come to light at a prominent estate in our county, involving matters that transgress both moral law and the natural order of our society. Archives from other regional newspapers revealed similar veiled references in the weeks that followed, each publication maintaining the pretense of discretion while ensuring their readership remained aware that something unprecedented had occurred among the planter class. The most revealing documentation of community reaction came from personal correspondence discovered in subsequent decades by historians researching various prominent families of the antebellum period. A letter dated March 22, 1857, written by Mrs. Eliza Carmichael to her sister in Savannah and discovered in the attic of the old Carmichael house during an estate sale in 1941, discussed the rumors circulating through society gatherings, expressing shock that a woman of Catherine's breeding could engage in such degradation and speculating whether the pregnancy that was whispered about could possibly be the result of such an unnatural union. Another letter, this one written by Mrs. Sarah Hampton to her cousin in Augusta and preserved in the Augusta Historical Society collections, debated whether Catherine had been an innocent victim overcome by circumstances, or whether she had willfully abandoned her duties as a wife and her position in society, noting that opinion among the ladies of the county remained sharply divided on this question, with some expressing sympathy for Catherine's youth and isolation, while others condemned her as a disgrace to Southern womanhood. On March 18, 1857, exactly 6 days after the discovery in the cotton barn, Samuel vanished from the Thornton plantation, and the official explanation for his disappearance appeared in Edmund's plantation ledger with stark simplicity. The entry, written in Edmund's own hand and dated March 18th, recorded the sale of one male slave, Samuel, age 18, to a trader named Cyrus Blackwell for the sum of $800, noting that Blackwell's destination was the cotton plantations of the Mississippi Delta, where demand for field laborers commanded premium prices. Subsequent investigations by historians attempting to trace Samuel's fate discovered that while a trader named Cyrus Blackwell did indeed operate in Georgia during this period, no records of any enslaved person matching Samuel's description appeared in any sales documentation, ship manifests, or plantation records throughout Mississippi, Louisiana, or any other Deep South state during 1857, or the years immediately following. The official narrative of Samuel's sale remained unchallenged for nearly half a century, until a startling revelation emerged in the autumn of 1904, when Thomas Pritchard, the son of overseer Jacob Pritchard, made a deathbed confession to his family minister, Reverend Michael Stone. The minister's personal journal, discovered among his papers donated to the Methodist Church archives in 1956, contained a detailed account of what Thomas Pritchard revealed in those final hours of his life. According to Reverend Stone's transcription of the confession, Thomas, who had been a young man of 22 in 1857 and who had assisted his father in various plantation duties, stated that Samuel had never been sold to any trader, but had instead been taken by his father and 3 other men to the dense pine woods beyond the northern property boundary on the night of March 18th. Thomas Pritchard reportedly told the minister that Samuel had not returned from those woods, that no sale had ever taken place, and that his father had carried the burden of this knowledge until his own death in 1889, extracting a promise from Thomas never to speak of it while any member of the Thornton family still lived. Following Samuel's disappearance, Catherine was moved to a set of rooms on the upper floor of the plantation house, where Edmund ordered the windows barred from the outside and a rotating guard of trusted servants posted at the door to ensure she could neither leave nor communicate with anyone beyond those he specifically permitted to enter. Dr. Walsh's medical journal entries from the period between March 1857 and August of that year documented a gradual but unmistakable deterioration in Catherine's mental and physical condition, describing a patient who had retreated into a state that alternated between catatonic silence and episodes of extreme agitation. The entry dated April 2, 1857, noted that Catherine had refused all food for 3 consecutive days and had to be persuaded to take even water, her physical health declining so rapidly that Dr. Walsh expressed concern she might not survive to term. More disturbing were the doctor's observations about Catherine's mental state, recorded in entries throughout the spring and summer months, describing how she would sit for hours staring at the barred windows without speaking, and how when she did speak, she repeatedly uttered variations of the same phrase, insisting that they had murdered an innocent soul and that his blood was on all their hands. Dr. Walsh noted his attempts to understand whom Catherine meant by these statements, but she would provide no clarification, falling back into silence whenever pressed for details. Edmund refused all requests from Catherine's family to visit her, sending away her father, Colonel Whitmore, when he arrived from Augusta in late April, informing him that Catherine's condition made visitors inadvisable, and that he alone would determine what was best for his wife and the child she carried. The plantation became increasingly isolated from the surrounding community during these months, with Edmund declining all social invitations and turning away callers at the gate, creating an atmosphere of siege that only intensified the rumors circulating through Wilkes County about what exactly was transpiring within the Thornton house. On the night of August 3, 1857, Catherine went into labor nearly 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Walsh had calculated, and the birth proved difficult, lasting from the early evening hours until just after dawn on August 4th. Dr. Walsh's medical journal entry from that date, written with the clinical detachment expected of a physician recording medical facts, described the successful delivery of a male child who appeared healthy despite the premature labor, weighing approximately 6 pounds and possessing all normal physical characteristics. However, the entry continued with observations that Dr. Walsh recorded in Latin, perhaps hoping to obscure their meaning from casual readers who might later examine his records, noting the infant's skin coloration, described as intermediate in tone, hair texture that he termed distinctly non-European, and facial features that he stated bore no resemblance to either parent of record, but suggested mixed ancestry in unmistakable terms. The physician's notes indicated that Catherine, though weakened by the prolonged labor, had held the child briefly and wept without speaking, while Edmund had left the room immediately upon seeing the infant and did not return during Dr. Walsh's remaining time at the house. Within hours of the birth, Edmund had summoned his attorney and begun making arrangements that Dr. Walsh described as urgent and highly unusual, though the specific nature of these arrangements was not detailed in the medical records. A baptismal certificate discovered in the records of the Wilkes County Episcopal Church showed that on August 5, 1857, Reverend Charles Morrison performed a private baptism at the Thornton plantation for an infant recorded as Thomas Edmund Thornton, son of Edmund and Catherine Thornton. Yet this child named Thomas appeared nowhere else in any surviving documentation related to the Thornton family. The family Bible, preserved through generations and eventually donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1932, contained birth records for Edmund's later children from subsequent marriages, but made no mention of any child born in 1857. Plantation records that meticulously documented every other aspect of the estate's operations contained no further reference to the infant after that single baptismal entry, as if the child had simply ceased to exist the moment he was given a name. Catherine Thornton disappeared from all official records after August of 1857, and the circumstances surrounding her vanishing became one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire affair, generating theories and speculation that would persist for over a century. Edmund reported to county authorities in September of 1857 that his wife had succumbed to complications from childbirth, a claim that was accepted without question in an era when such tragedies were unfortunately common, and several members of Wilkes County society later recalled attending a memorial service held at the plantation in late September. However, when researchers began investigating the case in the 20th century, they discovered that no death certificate for Catherine Thornton existed in county records. No notice of her death appeared in any newspaper, and most significantly, no grave bearing her name could be found in the Thornton family cemetery, where generations of the family had been interred beneath elaborately carved monuments. The infant who had been baptized as Thomas likewise vanished completely from all documentation after August 5th, with no record of his death, no mention in any correspondence, and no trace of what became of a child whose very existence posed an intolerable threat to Edmund's reputation and social standing. Investigations conducted by historians and genealogists in the 20th century produced multiple competing theories about the fate of both Catherine and her child. Records from the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville, examined by researchers in the 1970s, revealed an unnamed female patient, admitted in September 1857, described only as a young woman of good family who had suffered a complete mental collapse, though no documentation confirmed this patient's identity as Catherine Thornton. A more hopeful theory emerged from research conducted in the 1980s, when historians discovered fragmentary evidence suggesting that a woman matching Catherine's description, traveling with an infant, and using the name Mrs. Catherine Monroe, had appeared in a Quaker community in southeastern Pennsylvania in late 1857, where such communities were known to provide sanctuary for individuals fleeing the South, though again, definitive proof remained elusive. In the summer of 1998, a team of archaeologists from the University of Georgia, conducting a survey of former plantation sites in Wilkes County, obtained permission to excavate portions of the old Thornton property, which had long since been subdivided and sold to various owners following the family's departure from the area in the late 19th century. While investigating an area of dense woodland that historical maps indicated had once formed the northern boundary of the cultivated fields, researchers using ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly consistent with a burial site located approximately half a mile from where the main plantation house had stood. Excavation revealed an unmarked grave containing the skeletal remains of a young male, estimated through forensic analysis to have been between 18 and 20 years of age at the time of death, with evidence of severe trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force impact. The remains were dated through carbon analysis to the mid-19th century, and subsequent DNA testing conducted in 2003 after advances in genetic technology made such analysis possible from degraded samples established a familial connection between the remains and living descendants of the Thornton family line, though the exact nature of the relationship could not be determined with certainty. These findings seemed to corroborate the deathbed confession made by Thomas Pritchard nearly a century earlier, suggesting that Samuel had indeed met a violent end in those woods rather than being sold as Edmund's records claimed. Perhaps even more remarkable was the discovery made by genealogical researchers in 2005 when examination of records from the Chester County Historical Society in Pennsylvania revealed documentation from the Fallowfield Friends meeting, a Quaker community known for assisting fugitives from the South. These records showed that in November of 1857, a woman identifying herself as Catherine Monroe had arrived at the settlement with an infant son, requesting shelter and assistance, and that she had remained within the community until her death on March 3, 1889, living quietly and supporting herself through teaching, never remarrying, and never revealing her true origins, despite numerous gentle inquiries from community members over the decades. Despite the archaeological discoveries, the genealogical research, and the documentary evidence accumulated over more than a century of investigation, the true story of what transpired at the Thornton plantation in 1857 remains shrouded in ambiguity and competing interpretations that may never be fully reconciled. The descendants of the child, raised as Thomas Monroe in Pennsylvania, who can be traced through census records and other documentation into the 20th century, have consistently refused requests for DNA testing that might establish definitive genetic links to either the Thornton family or to the remains discovered in the unmarked grave, citing privacy concerns and a desire to let the past remain undisturbed. Edmund Thornton himself lived until 1891, remarrying twice after Catherine's disappearance, first to a widow from Augusta in 1860, and again in 1875, after her death to a much younger woman from Savannah, fathering 4 children who survived to adulthood and establishing a new branch of the family that bore no resemblance to the scandal that had nearly destroyed the Thornton name 3 decades earlier. According to family members interviewed by historians in the 1960s, Edmund never spoke of his first wife to his subsequent families, and any documents or personal effects related to Catherine were destroyed or removed from the family's possession, creating a deliberate void in the historical record that Edmund clearly intended to be permanent. The multiple truths that may coexist within this story resist simple categorization or moral judgment across the distance of more than 160 years. Was this a tale of forbidden love between 2 people who defied the brutal constraints of their society? Or was it a story of exploitation in which power dynamics made genuine consent impossible regardless of what either party may have believed or claimed? Was Catherine a transgressor who willfully abandoned her duties, or was she a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Did Samuel act as an agent of his own destiny in pursuing freedom through whatever means available, or was he destroyed by forces that gave him no real choice in any aspect of his existence? These questions persist without definitive answers, leaving only the fragments and whispers that echo across generations, reminding us that the machinery of slavery crushed all who challenged it, erasing lives and truths with equal efficiency, and leaving behind only shadows and speculation where human beings once loved, suffered, and disappeared into history's silence.